Hi everybody, my name is Danielle and I am a medievalist. I'm a medieval historian, which means that I study the Middle Ages, which is the time between about 500 and 1500, the years 500 and 1500. So the time of knights and castles and all that stuff, that is what I study for a living, which I think is pretty cool. And so I asked your parents to send me some of your questions about the Middle Ages because I know a lot of you are stuck at home right now and maybe you need something fun to do or you have questions and you just kind of want to see somebody who knows a little bit about that stuff talk to you about that stuff. So here I am to talk to you about the Middle Ages and answer the questions that a whole bunch of kids sent in to me. So I hope you enjoy this. So the first question I had was, how long are the Middle Ages? And the Middle Ages are about 1,000 years. So that's a very long time. Like I said, it's from about the year 500 to about the year 1500. So that's a very long time. And what I study is the continent of Europe. So if you haven't figured out where the continent of Europe is, maybe that's something to look up after this video. And so I study about 1,000 years and a whole continent, which is a lot of information. So I'm going to try and answer your questions best, but there's a lot of stuff to learn and a lot more stuff to learn than I might be able to tell you today. So where do we go from here? First thing I should remind you is Europe is just one place in the entire world. So if you like the stuff you learned today, hopefully you'll learn about what's going on in the rest of the world at this time. Okay, so how long was the Middle Ages? It was about 1,000 years. And why do they call it the Middle Ages? That was my next question. Why do they call it the Middle Ages? Well, it's kind of a snobby thing that they were doing, calling it the Middle Ages. What they were trying to say, these are people during Shakespeare's time, if you've ever heard of a guy called Shakespeare, during about that time, they were looking back on the time just before them and thinking it was not as cool as the time before that, which is when the Romans and Greeks were wandering around Europe. So they wanted to make themselves look very cool. So they called this time in between their favorite periods, the Greek and Roman time and their own time. They called this the Middle Ages, where they figured nothing really happened. And I think that you can kind of see that kind of stuff today when you're looking at your own music and you're looking back on your parents' music and you think it's just not very cool. And you might, say stuff like, that's old people music. That's what my kids say to me. It's kind of the same thing where the people were trying to show how cool they were by talking about the last people not being as cool. So they call it the Middle Ages because it's between what they thought were the coolest times of history. Okay, so my next question that I got asked was, how many knights were there in an army? And this is a very good question, and this is something that maybe grown-ups don't really know about the Middle Ages, which is that during most of the Middle Ages, people didn't have armies that were just kind of collected and sitting on an army base somewhere. What they did was they gathered up groups of knights and soldiers and archers and that kind of thing when they needed them. So how many knights were there in an army? As many as the king could get together at the time. So the king owned pretty much all the land in the country, and he would say to you, you can live on this land in return for giving me 60 knights when I need them. And so whenever the king called you up to fight, you had to bring your 60 knights. That was part of the agreement. But how many were there in an army? As many as the king could get together. Because they didn't have, like I said, they didn't have groups of armies that just kind of stuck together. Because if you did that, you'd have to take care of them and feed them and make sure they behave. And that's something that kings didn't really want to do. It made a lot more sense because they didn't fight every day, to just have an agreement where they could call on you and you'd bring your knights, and that would be what made up the army. The next question I got was, did they have bananas in England? This is a question no one has ever asked me before. I've been visiting classrooms for a few years and no one's ever asked me about bananas. So I had to look into this because I wasn't sure that people in England had coconuts, and then I found out from a friend of mine that they did have coconuts in England. So I looked this up. So bananas, as it turns out, seem to have started to grow just naturally around Indonesia, and people thought bananas were pretty awesome. So they started to import them and grow them across Asia. So you can see bananas start to move across Asia, and they start to grow them even in Africa and Madagascar and places like that. And they did grow bananas in the Middle East. they didn't grow bananas in England because it is too cold to grow bananas in England. It's still too cold to grow bananas in England, which is why they have to get their bananas from other places. Although I'm Canadian, so I say bananas, but in England they would have said bananas, right? So they weren't growing bananas in England, but people from England who had gone to the Middle East to travel, to visit, to go on pilgrimage, or to fight in the Crusades, they might have actually eaten bananas. But they couldn't get them back to England because if you have bananas in your kitchen, you know that they go brown and kind of gross after a few days, and it took a lot more than a few days to get to England from the Middle East. So there you go. No bananas in England, but English people might have eaten bananas when they were visiting the Middle East. So the next question is, did William the Conqueror have cows in his castle? This is a great question about cows. William the Conqueror was a king of England in what we call the 11th century, and he definitely had lots of castles. He loved to build castles. He probably didn't have a lot of cows in the castle itself, but he might have had cows outside of the castle. This is a good time to think about and talk about how castles were made. So I brought a book. This book is See Inside Castles, which is a great book. And on the inside, this is a page about a castle getting attacked. But you can see a lot of castles were built with this really tall kind of towery thing, which is what we tend to think of as a castle, called a keep. And that was in the middle. And outside of that, you'd have kind of a yard called a bailey. And in that area, you might have cows that you'd use to get milk for the kitchens. But there's not a huge amount of room inside here, so you probably wouldn't have loads of cows, just maybe enough cows to get the milk that you needed for the day for a few days. But this is how castles were built. There's a keep in the middle, and then they'd have a bailey around it, where they would keep things like horses and cows and archers and all that stuff. So this picture has some cows. There are probably some cows, but probably not a lot of cows in a castle in the Middle Ages. And here's my next question. Did they have math? And I'm guessing you're asking this question because you have to do math at home while you're inside, maybe not going to school. It's time to do math at home. Yes, they absolutely had math. So when your parents tell you you need to learn math, it's because it's very important. What do we use math for that you've probably learned in school? Well, we use it for measurement. We use it for money. We use it for science. We use it for telling time. We need math for everything. We need to do addition. When we get more stuff, we need to do subtraction when we get rid of stuff, or eating stuff. For example, if you were in the Middle East and you had six bananas, and then people ate 3, how many did you have left? So you did need to use math for this stuff. Multiplication, division, and especially fractions. So people were measuring, telling time, and all that stuff. For that, you need math. And you also need it for one of the other things somebody asked me about was, well, let's look at this. What do you see here? This is something that you probably have seen before, right? Is a die. 2 of them are dice. People played with dice in the Middle Ages with ones like this, which are made of bone. You can't really tell that it's bone in the video, but it is. So they made dice out of bones. And you can't play a dice game unless you can count, add, subtract, all of that stuff. So they definitely had math, and they played dice games. What other games did they play? Lots of them. They played soccer, they played chess, they played a game that I really like called backgammon, which you might want to learn if you haven't learned it already. It involves some triangles and some rocks. It's easy to put together. They also played card games later in the Middle Ages. They played badminton. They played all sorts of games. They loved to play games and sports. So when people think of the Middle Ages, I think a lot of grown-ups think of it as a time where nobody had any fun. Nobody smiled or told jokes. They're wrong about that. People played games and they had a lot of fun. So if you want to feel really medieval, play chess, play a dice game, play soccer, do that kind of stuff, and you are on board with medieval kids. Medieval kids also had dolls, and they also had tops, and they also had little pots and pans for cooking, and little knights. So they were very much like you. They enjoyed the same type of games, and toys that you do, except for your toys tend to have batteries, right? No batteries in the Middle Ages. One other thing someone asked about kids is, did they have dogs and cats as pets? And somebody asked me if they had snakes as pets too. And this is a very good question to which I don't have a lot of research. I do think people probably did keep some snakes as pets because that's something we like to do today. And the more I learn about the Middle Ages, the more I realize that they're a lot like we are. So if we like having pets, snakes today, you can bet that probably at least a few people had pet snakes back in the day. Probably not in England because it's very cold for snakes. As you probably already know, snakes can't make their own body heat, so they need to be warm all the time. And snakes in cold places, like where I live in Canada, we have to keep them under heat lamps, which they couldn't do in places like Scandinavia or England or anything like that. So I would say people probably had pet snakes, but probably where the snakes already lived. And then the other question that I got was, did people have dogs and cats as pets? And they did. Look, here's a whole book. This is for grown-ups. It's a grown-up book about medieval dogs. And here's another one about medieval cats. And look, the cat is doing its job. And while people had medieval people had dogs and cats as pets, often they had a job, like that cat's job is to catch mice, because there were a lot of mice running around medieval Europe at the time. They often had jobs, but one of the cool jobs that people don't realize dogs had were that sometimes medieval people used dogs as guide dogs, just like we do today. Now that's something that the grown-ups in your house might not know, but I think it's awesome. But sometimes they were just pets, like this. You can see an example. Somebody just has a dog on their lap, just a regular pet. So yeah, they had dogs and cats as pets, even if they were working some of the time. And if you would rather look at a picture book, here's one called The White Cat and the Monk. And this is about a monk who has a cat. And the cat catches mice for him, but it's also just a pet, just a companion that this monk has. That one's called The White Cat and the Monk. So yeah, people had pets too. What else do people ask me? Let's get on to food. There were lots of questions about food. One of the questions was, who made cheese? This is an awesome question. I love cheese too. And I think that it was mostly the women that probably made cheese, because if you look at a medieval farm, it's usually the men that are going out and plowing the fields. It's often the women and the children who are taking care of the animals. And women did a lot of stuff around food. I would guess it was the women that were making cheese at the time. They did make cheese, loved cheese, just like we love cheese. So I'm guessing it was the women who made cheese. But it was the kids who were also helping take care of animals, just like today on farms, or maybe in your house you're taking care of a pet. The kids did a lot of helping taking care of animals, so there would be no cheese in the Middle Ages unless you had kids helping to feed the cows and the goats that were making the milk that was needed for cheese. So kids had a big part in helping to make sure everybody had cheese. And here was another question someone asked me. What is my favorite recipe from the Middle Ages that we can make at home today? It's a very good question. And I'm not much of a cook. I don't know about you, but I'm not much of a cook at all. But I did try a recipe that's called Lombard pasties. Sometimes people say pasties because it sounds like pastries. But Lombard pasties are something I can give your parents a link to for the video, and you can try them out. And you can read an article that I did where I tried them out. So I said they're kind of like pastries because they do involve pastries. So if you picture what they look like, they're kind of like a medieval pizza pocket, right? There's a little bit of pastry and the good stuff is inside. But instead of cheese and pepperoni and stuff like that, a Lombard pasty has chicken and it has bacon in it and it has some spices in it as well. And the spices in the recipe that I'll give to you and that I tried were cinnamon and cloves. And we often think of cinnamon and cloves as being stuff that you have in maybe a pumpkin pie or in stuffing, so maybe stuff that you have around the holidays, but they are really good in these Lombard pasties. Lombard pasties and other pasties were something that people could make and they could carry with them because they are delicious whether they're hot or cold. They are something that people would sell on the street, like you would buy hot dogs on the street now. So they are really easy to make and they are delicious. You will enjoy them. So that's something you can try out, and I'll give you a link at the bottom of the video. There was another question about food. Where is it? Did they dye their food? This is a very cool question. Yeah, they did dye their food, and they made the most amazing desserts, especially. One of my friends told me about a cake that was made in the Middle Ages that was so big that it had musicians hiding on it. So like when they rolled it out in front of the king, there are musicians playing on top of this cake. So if you like to watch baking shows on Netflix, I'm telling you, the Middle Ages had really awesome desserts especially. And they dyed their food with things like berries or saffron, which is very expensive, and just other things that you could get from plants. Now, what I'm looking at right now is a book about paint. And I'll show it to you in a second. But a lot of the stuff that they use to dye clothes or to make paint is the type of stuff that they would use to make food look pretty as well. Oh, here we go. So this is a book called Marguerite Makes a Book. She's using plant stuff to make colors when she's making paint. So Marguerite is making paint in the Middle Ages. But as you know, we eat plants, and they ate plants back in the day too. So a lot of the stuff that you'd use to make paint, you could eat. So they would make paints, and they would make dyes for food out of the same stuff, which is pretty awesome. Another question I had was, did people believe in witches and wizards? Yeah, they believed in witches and wizards. Sometimes you will hear from grown-ups that they really hated witches and they really hated wizards. That is only sort of true. They were suspicious of people who they thought could do magic because they weren't sure how they got those powers. And sometimes they could be really mean about that. So you can see in the very end of the Middle Ages, you'll see witch trials where witches were in trouble, or people who they thought were witches were in trouble. But people did know about witches, they did believe in witches and wizards, but they like to keep them in stories, like we like to keep them in stories. Some of the most famous stories in the Middle Ages are about a guy called King Arthur. His sister had magical powers. Her name is Morgan. She's probably the most famous witch you could think of in medieval stories. And one of his friends was a wizard named Merlin, who was probably the most famous wizard in the Middle Ages in their stories. And they really liked stories about these people, even though maybe they were nervous when they thought they had a witch in their village. But yeah, they did believe in them, and sometimes they liked them in stories and sometimes they didn't like them in stories, kind of like today. I almost forgot to answer a really important question about chainmail. One of the questions that I got asked was, how did people create chainmail? And the answer is very slowly and carefully. So you'd be making chainmail out of rings, like these ones. I sometimes like to make chainmail jewelry, so I will show you how I do that, which is with a couple of tools and rings. Now, the chainmail armor that you make would be with bigger rings, but these ones are smaller rings. So you'd have an open ring, and you'd add another one, and you'd close it up. But if I show you this really closely, what do we still have at the top? Oh, there we go. What do we still have at the top? We still have a space, which means that if somebody poked it with an arrow, it would be really easy for it to come apart and split the chainmail. So when people were making chainmail armor, they would cross the two ends of the ring over, and then they would rivet them. And a rivet is kind of like a little piece of metal, a little round piece of metal that holds things together. And if you're wearing jeans right now, you'll see you probably have little rivets on your jeans, those little round bits of metal. It's holding that close together, just like you'd hold the chainmail ring close together. But something I want to show you about chainmail that grown-ups might not realize is it's actually very easy to move in. There's a lot of grown-ups that think it's hard to move in armor, and actually it's pretty easy to move in armor. So this is a pattern this is just a bracelet. This is a pattern called dragon scale that I tried to make. You see there's lots and lots of rings together. If you tried to get a sword through that, it would be pretty difficult, but an arrow could split it. Now, again, they'd have bigger rings for armor, but look at how easy it moves. It bends and bends and bends and bends. And so when people think that it's difficult to move in armor, well, it's very heavy to move in armor, but it's actually easier to move in armor than you think. It's very, chainmail especially is very bendy. Oh, here is a question. Somebody asked me, what did people with bad eyesight do? This is a good question because, I think a lot of us wear glasses. I wear glasses sometimes when I'm working, when I'm reading, and people did need to use glasses sometimes. And glasses are something that were invented in the Middle Ages. So when people get snobby about the Middle Ages, they are forgetting really important things like during the medieval period, they came up with buttons and eyeglasses and all sorts of other really cool stuff. So medieval glasses were not the same as our glasses now. Because our glasses now, we can make the lenses so it's easier to see things that are far away and easier to see things that are close up. But in the Middle Ages, they only really were good at making lenses that were like magnifying glasses that made things that were close bigger. And they didn't look like the glasses we have today. So here are my glasses today. You can see they have arms, they have lenses, they let me see things very well. In the Middle Ages, they look more kind of like scissors. Now, I'm going to show you these scissors, but you are going to promise me that you're not going to put scissors near your face, right? Promise? Okay. They look more like scissors, where they would be hinged in the middle, and they'd have two lenses that are kind of like two magnifying glasses hinged in the middle. So they would open up and they would sit on your nose. So I'm not putting these scissors near my face either, but we'll pretend they would look more like this. Medieval glasses look more like that. And we can see that they had them because they painted them in pictures of themselves. So they would sit on your nose like that. People did have glasses. So if you had bad eyesight and you needed to see things close you need to make them bigger, you could wear these. If you need to see something farther away, you were kind of out of luck, unfortunately, until people started to invent stuff like telescopes. Here's a question about Joan of Arc. And I get a question like this every time I talk to kids. And there's kind of good news and there's kind of bad news. The question is, was Joan of Arc the only woman who was a knight in armor? Okay, so a couple of things here. First of all, Joan of Arc did wear armor and she did fight, but she wasn't a knight. Knights were people who were trained from the time they were children. They were always men. They were trained from the time they were children to be fighters. Joan was not. Joan was a teenager, just a regular girl, but she believed she was sent on a mission from God to help France, so they gave her armor, but she wasn't a knight. There were warrior women, we think, in the Viking age, so people who watch How to Train Your Dragon, that kind of age, there seem to have been women who were warriors at that time. Most of the time, women were not warriors, but, and this is very important, that doesn't mean that they were wimps. Women had a lot of really important jobs in the Middle Ages, and a lot of times you would have men, husbands, dads, that kind of thing, that would be sent off to war. They'd go off to fight, right? The king would call them up and say, I need an army. You need to go and fight. Guess who was in charge when the men were away? The women were in charge, and they knew exactly what to do. They took care of everything. They made supplies, made sure they had everything that they needed. Sometimes people would come and attack their castle, and it was the women that had to decide how they were going to fight off the bad guys. And they could do it, and they were very good at it. We even know that there are queens who would defend their kingdom if the king was away or if he died and their son was too small to rule himself. We know that there were women who would stand on the castle walls and throw things at the bad guys. There's even one woman called Margaret of Beverley who went to the castle wall, the city wall, to fight off some people that she didn't want invading with a pot on her head because she didn't have a suit of armor. So women did not get raised to be knights. So that's the bad news. The good news is that they actually were very, very awesome in their own right. So anybody that thinks that women were just not as cool because they didn't wear armor, they haven't got that right. Women were really, really important in the Middle Ages, especially when the men were away. They were in charge of everything, and they did a really awesome job with that. Okay, I'm coming to my last question, the last question I got, and this is a question I was definitely expecting because somebody has a question about this. every time I speak to kids and even grown-ups. And the question is, what did they use for toilet paper? And I think toilet paper is on a lot of people's minds now because we are all trying to get the supplies we need so we can stay inside. In the Middle Ages, they did have to use something for toilet paper. It was not awesome. What they used was hay. And I don't know the last time you went on a hay ride or jumped on a hay bale. That stuff is scratchy and it leaves behind little seeds. It's not something that you want to go back to. So I think this is a friend named Jeremy who is asking his mom about this. Jeremy, don't use hay. Use toilet paper. Just listen to your mom and use toilet paper instead. For the people that didn't use hay, they sometimes used really old linen rags. Again, none of these are a really good choice. Stick with the modern world and stick with toilet paper. So this is just a quick video to tell you a little bit about the Middle Ages and give you a couple of things to look at. Maybe as time goes on, I can make better videos for you, but I wanted to thank you for sending me questions. I hope that you're all doing well and that you're safe inside, staying inside and learning lots of stuff. Thank you a lot for listening and take good care of yourselves. Bye.